In this section, in this part of section 8.2, we're on page 254, and we're asked to find the zeros of the function. So remember that means the x-intercepts. Where does our function cross the x-axis, or where is y equal to 0? So what we're looking for, so going back to the last page, what we're looking for is what are the x values here and here where it crosses the x-axis. The issue is that this happens somewhere between 1 and 2. So somewhere between 1 and 2. So we can't just estimate based on the graph if we want to know an exact answer. Sometimes you can do this by factoring. Other times we can do this by solving using a square root of x squared. So I'll show you both ways, and then you can decide what you think is best for you. So since y is equal to 0, first thing is set y equal to 0. Then we have negative x squared plus 1. If I wanted to factor this, then I don't like my x squared being negative. So first is I will factor out a negative 1. So divide negative 1 out. That gives me positive x squared. Positive 1 divided by negative 1 is minus 1. Here, if I wanted to factor this and I was using an x to figure out the two factors, since there's just a 1 in front of x squared, I don't need to use a box. So the top would be 1 times negative 1, or negative 1. Bottom would be 0. Two numbers that multiply to negative 1 and add to 0 are 1 times negative 1 and 1 plus negative 1. So this factors into x plus 1 and x minus 1. From here, we would have to set each equal to 0. So I would have x plus 1 equals 0, and also x minus 1 equals 0. So if I subtract 1 from both sides, that gives me a solution of, I don't like where I put that, sorry. It gives me a solution of x equals negative 1. So there's one of my two zeros or solutions. My other equation would be x minus 1 equals 0. And I would add 1 to both sides, and I'd end up with x equals positive 1. There's my other solution. So there's my two zeros. That means this graph crosses the x-axis at 1 and negative 1. Personally, I like doing this a little bit differently. So if I want to solve, since there's not a b term here, there's not a middle term, we don't have to factor. So um, if I set y equal to 0, then I can move the x squared over. So I would add x squared to both sides. And then I end up with x squared equals 64. So how do I get rid of a squared? Well, the opposite of squaring is taking the square root of both sides. So x squared, square rooted, that's just x. And then the square root of 64 could actually be one of two different things. The square root of 64 is saying what number squared equals 64. So either 8 times 8 is 64. So that means that one of my answers is 8. Or negative 8 times negative 8 also equals positive 64. So my other answer is negative 8. So I like this a little bit better. It's a little quicker than having to think through factoring. But the thing to remember is that you either get the positive or the negative value. When I look at number 6, do the same type of setup. So 0 equals negative 4x squared plus 16. Then I would add the 4x squared to the left side. So now I have 4x squared equals 16. Before I square root, I'd like to divide by 4 to get the x squared by itself. So now I have x squared equals 4, and then I can just square root both sides. So square root of x squared is x, square root of 4 is either 2 or negative 2. So there's my two answers. X either equals 2 or negative 2. One more with number 8. I'm going to skip those first two steps. Once I add the 9x squared over, I'd have 9x squared equals 1. If I divide by 9, now I'm working with x squared equals 1 over 9. So in square rooting on both sides, the square root of x squared is x, and then since 1/3 times 1/3 equals 1/9, the square root of 1/9 is either 1/3 or x could also equal negative 1/3. There's my two solutions. Applying that down to number 11, we have the function f of t equals negative 16t squared plus s sub 0 represents the approximate height. So height is f of t. You have a falling object t seconds after it is dropped from an initial height. So if a tennis ball falls from a height of 400 feet, that means we put 400 in for s sub 0. So the equation is, when does it hit the ground? That means the height is 0. So I'm putting a 0 in for height, negative 16t to the second, and then plus 400, because 400 is the initial height. So then I'd add the 16t squared, and then divide by 16 to get t squared by itself. So now I have t squared equals 25, because 400 divided by 16 is 25. Square root both sides. T then equals, what's the square root of 25? It's either 5 or negative 5. Well, you can't have negative 5 seconds, so that one doesn't make any sense. So that means that it takes 5 seconds to fall those 400 feet. If we decrease the initial height by 384 feet, that means now my initial height is only 16 feet. So it's the same equation, except I am using, it's the same equation, except I'm using 16 feet instead of 400. So if we add the 16t squared over, I wrote 400 again. Sorry about that. Meant that to be 16. Then divide by 16. So now I have t squared equals 1. Square root of 1 is either positive or negative 1. Negative time doesn't make sense, so time is 1 second. And done. Thank you.